Prince William and Kate's emotional appearance at the coronation leaves the nation deeply moved. The morning of May 6, 2023, dawned bright and clear over London. The city had been preparing for this day for months. King Charles III would finally receive his crown in Westminster Abbey, and the whole world was watching. But among all the royalty and dignitaries who would attend, everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of the Prince and Princess of Wales. William stood before the mirror in their private chambers, adjusting his ceremonial robes. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened the clasp. Kate noticed from across the room where she was having her hair arranged by their trusted stylist. She caught his eye in the reflection and gave him a small knowing smile. They both understood what this day meant. It wasn't just about crowns and ceremonies. It was about family, duty, and the weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. Their children had been unusually quiet that morning. George, at 9 years old, seemed to grasp the significance of what was about to happen. He would play an important role in the ceremony as one of his grandfather's pages of honor. Charlotte and Louis were trying to be brave, but Kate could see the nervousness in their eyes. She had spent the previous evening talking to them, explaining what would happen, helping them understand that even though everything would be formal and grand, they were still a family. Kate's dress had been chosen with great care. It was elegant but not ostentatious, respectful but still radiating quiet confidence. The ivory silk gown was embroidered with delicate floral patterns that seemed to shimmer when she moved. Her headpiece was a modified version of a tiara that had belonged to William's late mother, Princess Diana. Every time Kate wore something connected to Diana, she felt a strange mixture of honor and responsibility. She was walking a path that Diana never got to complete, raising the children Diana never got to see grow up. As their car made its way through the streets of London toward Westminster Abbey, William reached over and took Kate's hand. Through the tinted windows, they could see thousands of people lining the streets. Some had camped overnight just to get a good spot. British flags waved everywhere, mixed with handmade signs and banners. The crowds were shouting and cheering, but inside the car, there was a moment of peaceful silence between husband and wife. William thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had passed away just 8 months earlier. She would have loved this day, seeing her son finally crowned, but her absence created a hollow feeling in his chest. The Queen had been the anchor of their family, the steady presence who guided them through every storm. Now she was gone and his father was stepping into her shoes. Sooner than William sometimes wanted to think about, it would be his turn. Kate squeezed his hand tighter. She always seemed to know what he was thinking. That was one of the things he loved most about her. After more than 20 years together, they had developed a language that required no words. A look, a touch, a slight change in breathing pattern, these small things communicated volumes between them. The car pulled up to Westminster Abbey, and suddenly the quiet moment was over. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. The roar of the crowd became deafening. Security personnel moved into position. Protocol officers stood ready to guide them through every step. William took a deep breath and stepped out of the car first, then turned to help Kate emerge. The moment her foot touched the ground, the crowd's cheers reached a new level of intensity. They walked slowly up the ancient steps of the Abbey, the same steps where William's parents had married, where his grandmother had been crowned 70 years earlier, where centuries of British history had unfolded. Every stone seemed to whisper stories of the past. Inside, the Abbey was filled with 2,000 guests. World leaders sat alongside movie stars and community heroes. The air was thick with perfume, incense, and anticipation. William and Kate took their designated seats. From there, they could see everything. The altar where the Archbishop of Canterbury would perform the ceremony. The coronation chair that had held every British monarch since 1308. The crown jewels that would soon rest upon his father's head. William felt the weight of tradition settling over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a transfer of responsibility that stretched back over 1,000 years. Young George looked so serious in his page's uniform. William watched his eldest son standing straight and tall, trying so hard to do everything perfectly. He saw himself in that little boy. He remembered standing at his own father's side during formal occasions, desperate not to make a mistake, feeling the eyes of the world judging every movement. His heart ached with pride and concern in equal measure. The trumpet sounded and everyone rose to their feet. King Charles entered the Abbey and the ceremony began. But as William watched his father walk slowly toward the altar, something unexpected happened. His vision blurred with tears. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure, but the emotions were overwhelming. This was his father, the man who had held him as a baby, who had tried his best after Diana died, who had waited his entire life for this moment. Kate noticed immediately. Without anyone else seeing, she moved her hand slightly so that her fingers brushed against his. It was the smallest gesture, barely perceptible to anyone watching, but to William it was everything. It said, "I'm here. You're not alone. We'll get through this together." Just like we always do, the ceremony continued with ancient rituals and solemn vows. The Archbishop anointed Charles with holy oil. The crown was placed upon his head. The congregation shouted, "God save the King," in unison. Through it all, William and Kate sat together, their shoulders touching, their breathing synchronized, presenting a united front to the world while privately supporting each other through one of the most emotionally complex days of their lives. When it was time for William to pay homage to his father, he stood and walked forward. Every eye in the abbey followed him. Television cameras from around the world zoomed in on his face. He knelt before his father, placed his hands between the king's hands, and spoke the words of loyalty and service. But as he looked up into his father's eyes, he saw something that made his voice catch. Charles was crying too. These weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of love, of pride, of recognition that they were now bound together in a new way. Father and son embraced, breaking with centuries of formal protocol. It was a moment of pure human connection in the midst of all the pageantry. The nation watching on television collectively held its breath, and many found their own eyes growing wet. When William returned to his seat beside Kate, she could see that he was shaken. His hands were trembling again, and his breathing was uneven. She leaned in close, pretending to adjust her dress, and whispered something only he could hear. Whatever she said made him nod slightly and take a steadying breath. This was their partnership in action. When one faltered, the other provided strength. The ceremony seemed to last forever and yet pass in an instant. Music filled the ancient building with sounds that had echoed through these walls for centuries. The choir's voices rose and fell like waves. Prayers were offered in languages both old and new. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed countless times, yet somehow it still felt spontaneous and alive. Charlotte sat very still, her small hands folded in her lap. She was only 8 years old, but she understood that this was an important day. She had watched her mother get ready that morning, seen the care Kate took with every detail, noticed the way her parents exchanged meaningful glances. Children are more observant than adults often realize. Charlotte knew her parents were feeling many emotions, even if she couldn't name them all. Louis, at 5 years old, was having a harder time sitting still. He fidgeted with his collar and looked around the abbey with wide eyes, taking in all the colors and sounds and strange costumes. At one point, he caught his grandfather's eye during the ceremony, and Charles gave him a tiny wink that no one else noticed. Louis grinned and settled down a bit after that. Even in the midst of becoming king, Charles was still a grandfather who loved his grandchildren. As the ceremony progressed, television cameras captured moments that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. The way Kate gently touched William's arm during the anointing. The tear that rolled down William's cheek when the crown was placed on his father's head. The look of pure love that passed between husband and wife when they thought no one was watching. These small human moments were what made the ancient ceremony feel relevant and real to people watching at home. Outside the abbey, the crowds were growing larger by the minute. People from all walks of life had come together to witness history. There were elderly people who remembered Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953. There were young families who had brought their children to see something they would tell their own grandchildren about someday. There were tourists from every corner of the globe, all united in this moment of shared experience. Inside, the ceremony moved toward its conclusion. Charles had been crowned and blessed. He had taken his oaths and received the symbols of his authority. Now it was time for the procession back to Buckingham Palace. As the newly crowned king prepared to leave the abbey, William and Kate stood with the rest of the congregation. She smoothed down her dress and made sure her headpiece was straight. He squared his shoulders and prepared to face the cameras once more. They walked out of the abbey into brilliant sunshine. The contrast between the dim, candle-lit interior and the bright daylight outside was startling. William blinked against the glare and felt Kate's hand slip into his. Together they walked toward their car, waving to the crowds who screamed their names with enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. The journey back to Buckingham Palace took them through streets packed with well-wishers. The noise was incredible. People were singing, chanting, waving flags, holding up their phones to capture photos and videos. Some were crying with joy. Others were laughing and dancing. The atmosphere was electric with celebration and hope. Inside the car, William finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. Kate watched him with concern and tenderness. She knew how much this day had cost him emotionally. He had to be strong for his father, strong for his children, strong for the nation. But with her, he could let the mask slip just a little. They talked quietly as the car moved slowly through the crowds. They talked about George and how proud they were of how he had handled his responsibilities. They talked about Charlotte and Louis and how they would help them process everything they had witnessed. They talked about Charles and how different he had looked with the crown on his head. They talked about the future and what it would mean for their family. But mostly they just sat together in companionable silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. This was what their marriage had become over the years. It wasn't always about grand romantic gestures or passionate declarations. It was about being there day after day, supporting each other through whatever life threw at them. The car arrived at Buckingham Palace, where thousands more people were gathered. The balcony appearance was scheduled for later, but first there would be a private moment for the family. As William and Kate entered the palace, they were met by staff members who congratulated them and ushered them toward the private apartments. The children came running when they saw their parents. George was exhausted but proud. Charlotte wanted to tell them everything she had seen and heard. Louis was hungry and ready to get out of his formal clothes. Kate knelt down to hug all three of them, not caring that she was wrinkling her expensive dress. William watched his wife with their children and felt his heart swell with love. Charles appeared in the doorway, still wearing the crown and robes. He looked tired but happy. William went to him and they embraced again, this time without the cameras and crowds. Father and son held each other for a long moment, and when they pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes once more. Camilla, now queen consort, joined them. She had been through her own emotional journey that day. She hugged Kate tightly, two women who had both married into this extraordinary family and learned to navigate its unique challenges. They understood each other in ways that few others could. The family gathered in one of the private sitting rooms. For a few precious minutes, they were just a family. They laughed about little moments from the ceremony. They teased Louis about his fidgeting. They praised George for his perfect behavior. They sat together and breathed, letting the magnitude of what had just happened begin to sink in. But even in this private moment, they all knew that soon they would have to go back out and face the public again. The balcony appearance was a crucial part of the day's events. Millions of people were waiting to see the new king and his family appear before them. It was tradition, duty, and spectacle all rolled into one. Kate excused herself to check her appearance and make sure the children looked presentable. William went with her, helping to straighten George's jacket and smooth down Charlotte's hair. These small acts of parenting felt normal and grounding in the midst of such an abnormal day. The time came to make their way to the famous balcony. Palace staff guided the family through the corridors, each footstep echoing on the polished floors. William could hear the roar of the crowd even from inside the building. The sound penetrated the thick walls and heavy curtains, a constant reminder that the world was waiting. Kate held Louis's hand tightly. The little boy was both excited and nervous about appearing before so many people. She had talked to him earlier about what would happen, explaining that all he needed to do was wave and smile. But she knew that the reality of facing that massive crowd could be overwhelming, even for adults who were used to public attention. As they approached the balcony doors, William felt his heartbeat quicken. He had done this countless times before, but today felt different. Today his father was king. Today the line of succession had shifted in a way that made his own future role feel suddenly more immediate and real. He looked at Kate, and she gave him that smile that always steadied him. The smile that said everything would be all right. The doors opened and the family stepped out onto the balcony. The noise that greeted them was like a physical force. Thousands upon thousands of people packed the mall and the area in front of the palace, all cheering and waving and celebrating. The sea of faces stretched as far as the eye could see. British flags created waves of red, white, and blue throughout the crowd. Charles and Camilla stood at the center, as was proper for the newly crowned king and queen. William and Kate stood to one side with their children. The working members of the royal family flanked them, creating a tableau that would be photographed and painted and remembered for generations to come. The crowd's cheers reached a fever pitch when they saw William and Kate, the Prince and Princess of Wales, were immensely popular with the British people. They represented youth, hope, and a modern approach to ancient traditions. When Kate waved, holding Louis up so he could see better, the crowd responded with even louder cheers. William looked out at all those faces and felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. These were his people. One day they would be his subjects. He would have to serve them, protect them, represent them to the world. The thought was both terrifying and inspiring. Charlotte waved enthusiastically, her earlier nervousness forgotten in the excitement of the moment. George stood straight and serious, very aware of his role as future king. Even at his young age, he understood that he was different from other children, that his life would follow a path already laid out by history and tradition. The Royal Air Force flew overhead in formation, trailing smoke in red, white, and blue. The crowd gasped and pointed at the sky. The planes roared past, a dramatic display of British military might and precision. Louis clapped his hands with delight, momentarily forgetting to wave at the people below. Kate caught William's eye and they shared a private smile. Despite all the formality and protocol, despite the weight of history and the expectations of millions, they were still just parents watching their children experience something magical. That reality grounded them and reminded them what truly mattered. After the balcony appearance, the family retreated back inside the palace. The children were finally allowed to change out of their formal clothes and have something to eat. Kate supervised while William spoke with his father about the day's events. There was so much to discuss, so many details to review, so many decisions to be made about what would come next. But those conversations would have to wait. First, there would be a formal lunch with important guests, then photographs to be taken for the official record, then countless other obligations that came with being part of the royal family on such a significant day. The work of being royal never truly stopped, even on days that should have been purely celebratory. Kate found a quiet moment to step into a small side room and simply breathe. She looked at herself in a mirror and was surprised by what she saw. Her makeup was still perfect, her hair still in place, her dress unwrinkled. But her eyes told a different story. They showed the emotional toll of the day, the strain of being constantly watched and judged, the challenge of supporting her husband while managing her own feelings. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. William entered, closing the door behind him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. They stood there, holding each other, not speaking, just being together. It was what they both needed. He told her how grateful he was for her presence, for her strength, for her unwavering support. She told him how proud she was of him, of how he had handled the day with such grace and dignity. They talked about the children and how well they had done. They talked about Charles and how emotional the ceremony had been. They talked about the future and the challenges it would bring. Someone knocked again, more urgently this time. Duty was calling them back. They straightened their clothes, checked their appearances, and put on their public faces once more. But as they walked back into the formal areas of the palace, their hands brushed together, a secret reminder of their private connection. The official photographs took hours. Different groupings of family members, different poses, different expressions. Smile here, look serious there, turn slightly to the left, chin up just a bit. Kate had done this so many times she could almost do it in her sleep, but it was still exhausting. She watched William go through the same motions, saw the strain on his face that no one else would notice. George, Charlotte, and Louis were remarkably patient during the photo session, but eventually their energy began to flag. Louis started to whine and Charlotte's smiles became forced. Kate quietly suggested that perhaps the children had done enough for one day, and thankfully everyone agreed. The little ones were taken away by their nanny to rest and play, finally allowed to be children again rather than royal performers. As evening approached, the formal lunch gave way to more casual gatherings. Close friends and family members who had been part of the day's events relaxed together, sharing memories and impressions. The atmosphere became warmer and more intimate. Charles seemed to shed some of the formal bearing he had carried all day and became simply a father and grandfather again. William found himself thinking about his grandmother repeatedly throughout the evening. She had taught him so much about duty, about service, about putting the needs of the country before personal desires. He missed her wisdom and her steady presence. But he also felt her approval somehow, as if she was watching from somewhere beyond and was proud of how the day had unfolded. Kate stayed close to William throughout the evening, monitoring his emotional state, offering support when needed, giving him space when he needed to process things on his own. Their partnership had deepened over the years until they could anticipate each other's needs almost instinctively. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, the palace grew quieter. The sounds of celebration from outside had faded as the crowds dispersed, making their way home through London's streets. Inside, staff moved efficiently through the rooms, clearing away glasses and plates, restoring order to spaces that had been filled with people and noise for hours. William and Kate finally made their way to the children's rooms to say goodnight. George was already in bed, reading a book about British history that seemed fitting for the day. He looked up when his parents entered and asked questions about parts of the ceremony he hadn't understood. William sat on the edge of the bed and explained as best he could, trying to help his son make sense of traditions that stretched back centuries. Charlotte was still awake too, though fighting sleep. She wanted to talk about all the beautiful dresses she had seen, about the music and the flowers and the jewels. Kate sat with her daughter, stroking her hair and listening patiently. These were the moments that mattered most to her, these quiet times with her children when they were just a normal family having normal conversations. Louis had already fallen asleep, exhausted by the long day. They looked in on him and Kate gently adjusted his blankets. William stood in the doorway watching and felt a lump form in his throat. His youngest child looked so small and peaceful, completely unaware of the enormous role his family played in the nation's life. How long would that innocence last? After the children were settled, William and Kate returned to their own private rooms. Kate kicked off her shoes with a sigh of relief and began the process of removing all the pins from her hair. William loosened his collar and tie, finally able to breathe properly after hours of being formally dressed. They moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of a long marriage, not needing to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Kate sat at her dressing table and began removing her makeup while William sat in a nearby chair watching her. The mirror reflected both of their faces, and he found himself studying them as if seeing them for the first time. They had both changed so much since they first met as students at university. The carefree young people they had been seemed like different people now. Life had shaped them, challenged them, tested them in ways they could never have imagined. He thought about the early days of their relationship, when they could go to pubs and restaurants without causing a scene, when they could be relatively anonymous. Those days were long gone now. Every time they stepped out in public, cameras followed. Every outfit Kate wore was analyzed and copied. Every expression on their faces was interpreted and discussed. The loss of privacy had been one of the hardest adjustments of their life together, but Kate had handled it all with remarkable grace. She had transformed from a shy young woman overwhelmed by media attention into a confident public figure who knew exactly how to navigate the complicated world of royal life. She had made mistakes along the way, they both had, but she had learned and grown stronger. William's respect and admiration for his wife had only deepened over time. Kate turned from the mirror to look at him directly. She asked if he was all right, really all right. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He could have given her the easy answer, the polite deflection he gave everyone else. But this was Kate. She deserved and demanded honesty. He admitted that he was struggling with conflicting emotions. Pride in his father for finally achieving something he had waited for his entire life. Sadness that his grandmother wasn't there to see it. Fear about his own future and the burden that would one day fall on his shoulders. Worry about what kind of world his children would inherit. Gratitude for her constant support and love. Kate came to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. She reminded him that they would face whatever came together, just as they always had. They were a team, partners in the truest sense. When the crown eventually came to him, she would be right there beside him, just as she had been today beside him during his father's coronation. They talked late into the night, something they hadn't done in a long time. The demands of royal duty and raising 3 children often left them too exhausted for deep conversations. But tonight felt different. Tonight they needed to process everything that had happened, to make sense of the emotions that had overwhelmed them both throughout the day. William spoke about the moment when he had knelt before his father and pledged his loyalty. The centuries-old words had felt both ancient and immediate, connecting him to every Prince of Wales who had come before, while also binding him to a future that sometimes felt like a prison. He loved his country and wanted to serve, but the cost of that service was high. His life was not his own, and neither were his children's lives. They had been born into roles they could never escape. Kate understood in a way few others could. She had chosen this life, but sometimes the weight of that choice pressed down on her. She'd given up her privacy, her anonymity, her ability to make mistakes without the world watching and judging. She had taken on responsibilities that would have broken many people, and she had done it all because she loved William and believed in the importance of what they were doing together. But she also talked about the rewards, the incredible privilege of being able to use their platform for good, to shine a light on important causes, to make a real difference in people's lives. The joy of seeing their children growing up with a sense of duty and service. The satisfaction of representing their country on the world stage. The deep connection she felt to the British people, who had accepted her and welcomed her into their hearts. As they talked, William felt some of the tension that had been coiled inside him all day begin to unwind. This was the power of their relationship. They could be vulnerable with each other, could share their fears and doubts without judgment. They could be weak sometimes because they knew the other would be strong. Kate suggested they should try to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and obligations. But William wasn't quite ready. He wanted to hold on to this moment a little longer, this rare time when the world's demands were kept at bay and they could just be themselves. They moved to the window and looked out over London. The city lights twinkled in the darkness, millions of people going about their lives, most of them now sleeping peacefully. Somewhere out there were people who had stood in the cold for hours just to catch a glimpse of the royal family. Somewhere were people who had watched the ceremony on television, who had celebrated in the streets, who had felt connected to something larger than themselves. William felt the weight of responsibility settle over him again, but this time it felt different. Less crushing, more purposeful, he was part of something that stretched back over 1,000 years, and would hopefully continue for 1,000 more. He was a link in a chain connecting past to future, and Kate was right there with him, sharing the burden, making it bearable. They stood together at the window for a long time, arms around each other, drawing strength from their closeness. The day had been emotionally exhausting, but it had also reminded them of what they had together. Their partnership was the foundation on which everything else was built. The days following the coronation brought a strange mixture of normalcy and continued public attention. William and Kate tried to establish some routine for the children, but the world wasn't ready to stop talking about what had happened at Westminster Abbey. Every newspaper, every television channel, every social media platform was still analyzing every moment of the ceremony. The photographs of William's tears had become iconic almost immediately. People around the world had connected with that raw display of emotion. In an age where the royal family was sometimes criticized for being too distant or formal, seeing the future king cry openly had humanized him in a profound way. Commentators called it a turning point, a sign that the monarchy was evolving and becoming more emotionally accessible. Kate's role in supporting her husband had not gone unnoticed either. Body language experts analyzed every touch, every glance, every small gesture between them. Articles were written praising her steady presence, her ability to provide strength without overshadowing anyone else. Young women around the world pointed to her as an example of grace under pressure, of how to maintain dignity while also being genuine and warm. But the attention was overwhelming at times. Kate found herself having to reassure Charlotte that no, they could not go to the park like they used to without causing a scene. She had to explain to Louis why there were photographers outside their home trying to get pictures. She had to help George understand that being in the public eye was now a permanent part of their lives. not just something that happened on special occasions. William struggled with his own reactions to the attention. Part of him was glad that people had responded so positively to the coronation and his family's role in it, but another part of him resented the constant scrutiny, the endless analysis of private moments, the way nothing could ever just be theirs alone. He talked to Kate about it, and she listened without judgment, understanding his frustration even as she helped him see the bigger picture. They received thousands of letters and messages from people around the world. Some were from British citizens expressing their support and loyalty. Others came from people in Commonwealth countries who felt connected to the royal family, despite living thousands of miles away. Many were from people who had lost their own parents or faced their own difficult transitions, who saw their own struggles reflected in William's emotional journey. Kate made sure that some of these letters reached William, particularly ones that she thought might bring him comfort. She understood that he sometimes felt isolated in his unique position, that very few people could truly understand what it was like to be heir to the throne. Reading about how his honesty had touched others helped him see value in vulnerability, something he had been taught to suppress for most of his life. The children slowly adjusted to being back in their normal routines. George returned to school and had to endure his classmates' questions and comments about the coronation. He handled it with maturity beyond his years, answering questions politely but not boasting or making himself seem more important than others. His teachers reported that he seemed to be processing the experience well, though they noticed he seemed more thoughtful and quiet than usual. Charlotte threw herself back into her activities with enthusiasm, happy to be doing normal things again. But Kate noticed that her daughter sometimes seemed lost in thought, and when asked, Charlotte would mention something from the coronation that had stuck with her. The music, the flowers, the way everyone had been so serious and formal. She was trying to make sense of what it all meant for her family and her future. Louis, being the youngest, bounced back quickest. Within days, he had moved on from the coronation and was focused on his toys, his friends, and his ordinary 5-year-old concerns. Kate was grateful that at least one of her children could still experience childhood without too much awareness of their unusual circumstances. William and Kate had several meetings with Charles in the weeks following the coronation. The transition to a new reign meant changes in how things were done, new expectations, and new responsibilities for everyone in the family. Charles valued William's input and wanted to make sure the next generation felt included in shaping the future of the monarchy. These conversations were sometimes difficult. Father and son had not always had an easy relationship. Charles had been absent during much of William's childhood, consumed by his own duties and struggles. The wounds from Diana's death and its aftermath had never fully healed for William. But the coronation seemed to have opened a door to deeper understanding between them. William began to see his father, not just as the man who had hurt his mother, but as someone who had also suffered and sacrificed. Charles had waited over 70 years to become king, had endured decades of criticism and mockery, had seen his first marriage fall apart in spectacular and public fashion. He had loved Camilla for most of his adult life, but had been forced to give her up and marry someone else. The pain and loss Charles had experienced gave William a new perspective. Kate facilitated some of these healing conversations. She had a good relationship with Charles and could speak to both men about the other in ways that helped bridge the gap between them. She understood that for William to fully embrace his future role, he needed to make peace with his past and with his father. She gently guided both men toward reconciliation, never pushing too hard, but consistently reminding them of what they shared. The public watched this family drama play out through carefully staged photographs and occasional interviews. They saw William and Charles appearing together at events, saw the way they interacted with more warmth than in previous years. People wanted to believe in this story of healing and moving forward. After all the scandals and tragedies that had plagued the royal family, the public craved a narrative of hope and renewal. But William and Kate knew that real change happened in private moments, not in photo opportunities. It happened in quiet conversations over tea, in shared laughter during family dinners, and the small acts of consideration and kindness that rebuilt trust over time. They were committed to doing the work, both as a couple and as members of a larger family trying to navigate complicated relationships and even more complicated public roles. Kate continued to pursue her charitable work, focusing on early childhood development and mental health. These causes had become deeply important to her, and she threw herself into them with genuine passion. William supported her completely, proud of how she had carved out her own identity and areas of expertise within the royal framework. She was not just his wife or a princess. She was a force in her own right. William resumed his own duties, which included supporting various charities and representing the crown at official functions. But he also made time for his family, fiercely protecting their private time together. He had learned from his own childhood, from the time his mother had not been there because she was lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. He was determined to be present for his children, to give them stability and love even as their lives unfolded in the public eye. The coronation had been a watershed moment for all of them. It had forced them to confront difficult emotions and uncomfortable truths, but it had also brought them closer together, reminded them of what mattered most, and renewed their commitment to each other and to the roles they had been born or married into. As months passed after the coronation, its impact continued to ripple through the royal family and the nation. The image of William's tears had become symbolic of a new era, one where emotions were not hidden but acknowledged. The monarchy had always been about duty, tradition, and stoic service, but perhaps it could also be about authenticity, vulnerability, and human connection. Kate noticed changes in William that pleased her. He seemed more comfortable in his own skin, more willing to show his feelings rather than always maintaining a carefully controlled facade. The coronation had broken something open in him, released years of pent-up emotion, and allowed him to begin healing wounds he had carried since childhood. She supported this growth, encouraged it, celebrated each small step toward wholeness. Their marriage had always been strong, but the shared experience of the coronation had deepened their bond even further. They had weathered the intense public scrutiny together, had supported each other through emotional storms, had emerged on the other side even more united. They began to see themselves not just as husband and wife, but as true partners in every sense of the word. The children continued to grow and develop, each in their own way coming to terms with their unique position in the world. George was becoming more serious and thoughtful, aware that he would one day be king. His parents tried to give him as normal a childhood as possible, while also preparing him for the responsibilities that lay ahead. It was a difficult balance, but they worked hard at it, determined not to let him be crushed by the weight of expectation. Charlotte had inherited her mother's grace and her father's sense of duty. She understood that while she would never be queen, she still had important roles to play. She watched Kate carefully, learning how to navigate the complex world of royal life with dignity and warmth. Their mother-daughter relationship deepened as Charlotte grew older and began asking more sophisticated questions about what it meant to be a princess. Louis remained the family's joy and comic relief. His innocent questions and unfiltered reactions to royal life brought laughter into their home. Kate was especially protective of his childhood, wanting him to have as much freedom and fun as possible before the full weight of royal expectations settled on his shoulders. William supported this completely, remembering his own younger brother and the challenges Harry had faced being the spare rather than the heir. William's relationship with his father continued to improve. They found common ground in their shared experiences and responsibilities. Charles appreciated William's modern perspective and innovative ideas. William came to value his father's wisdom and decades of experience. They were becoming colleagues as well as family, working together to shape the future of the monarchy. The public's affection for William and Kate seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. They had become symbols of hope and stability in uncertain times. When they appeared at public events, crowds gathered to see them. When they spoke about causes they cared about, people listened. When they shared glimpses of their family life, the nation responded with warmth and enthusiasm. Kate had grown tremendously in confidence over the years. The shy young woman who had once struggled with public speaking had become a polished communicator who could address audiences with ease. She had found her voice and her purpose, and she used both to make a real difference in areas she cared deeply about. Her work on early childhood development was changing how society thought about the crucial early years of life. William threw himself into causes related to mental health, homelessness, and conservation. He wanted to use his platform to shine a light on issues that mattered, to make the monarchy relevant to contemporary concerns. He spoke openly about his own mental health struggles, about the therapy he had needed after his mother's death, about the importance of seeking help. His honesty inspired countless others to address their own mental health challenges. Together, William and Kate were reshaping what it meant to be royal in the modern age. They maintained respect for tradition and protocol, while also being accessible and relatable. They understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to evolve, to remain relevant to each new generation. They took this responsibility seriously, but they also tried not to let it consume every moment of their lives. They made sure to carve out private time as a family, protecting it fiercely from intrusion. They took the children on holiday, played games together, had family movie nights. These ordinary moments were precious to them, reminders that beneath the titles and tiaras, they were just people who loved each other and wanted to be happy. Looking back on the coronation, William realized it had been a turning point in multiple ways. It had been about his father becoming king, yes, but it had also been about William accepting his own future. He had spent years trying not to think too much about the day when the crown would pass to him, but the coronation had forced him to confront that reality. And in confronting it, he had found a measure of peace. Kate had her own reflections about that momentous day. She thought about how far she had come from the ordinary girl from Berkshire, who had fallen in love with a prince at university. She had been tested and challenged in ways she could never have imagined. There had been moments when she had doubted herself, wondered if she was strong enough or worthy enough. But she had persevered, had grown stronger, had proven to herself and to the world that she belonged. The coronation had shown the nation and the world what William and Kate had known privately for years, that they were a team, united in purpose and in love. The way they had supported each other throughout that emotional day had been captured in photographs and videos that would be studied by historians for decades to come. Their relationship had become part of the larger story of the monarchy's evolution. As another anniversary of the coronation approached, William and Kate decided to mark it quietly, as a family. They would attend any official events required of them, but privately they would use the day to reflect on how much had changed and how much they had all grown. They would talk to the children about what they remembered, answer questions, share memories. William took Kate's hand as they sat together watching their children play in the garden. He told her that he could not imagine going through any of this without her by his side. She was his anchor, his strength, his partner in every way that mattered. The coronation had been difficult, but it had also reminded him of how lucky he was to have found someone who understood him so completely. Kate leaned her head on his shoulder and watched their children laugh and run and simply be young. This was what it was all about, she thought. Not the crowns or the ceremonies or the public appearances. It was about love, about family, about raising children who would carry these traditions forward while also making them their own. It was about finding joy and meaning in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. The coronation had moved the nation, had touched hearts around the world, but for William and Kate its greatest impact had been personal. It had brought them closer together, had strengthened their marriage, had reminded them of what truly mattered. They had faced one of the most challenging days of their lives with grace and honesty, and they had emerged stronger for it. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, just as they always had. Hand in hand, heart to heart, partners in life and in duty, they were ready for whatever came next.